Pragati Yadav's dreams of freedom, Arvind Bhadouria's dangerous obsession, Nitin Chaubey's blind loyalty, Samir Rathod's quiet honesty, and Inspector Raghav Tandon's relentless pursuit of justice together. Their lives collided in Auraiya to create a horrifying love story that no one ever wished to witness. In the district of Auraiya, where narrow roads cut through fields of mustard and wheat, the story of Pragati Yadav began like a dream that many young girls quietly nurtured. Pragati was admired in her neighborhood not only for her beauty, but also for her ambition. She was a woman who carried herself with grace, her dark eyes reflecting curiosity about the world beyond the village she grew up in. While most of her peers settled into lives decided by tradition, Pragati envisioned something far different. She wanted freedom, respect, and a chance to step into a life where her choices would define her, not the expectations of her family. That determination shaped her into a figure many spoke about with admiration, though it also stirred envy among others who considered her too bold. Her life changed when she crossed paths with Arvind Bhadoria, a man whose reputation traveled faster than his presence. Arvind was not an ordinary suitor. He was known for his wealth, his polished manner, and his ability to command attention wherever he went. His expensive car, his tailored clothes, and his connections to influential people made him stand out in Auraiya, where modesty and tradition often defined status. Pragati was drawn to him not only for his charm, but for the sense of escape he represented. With him, she felt as if she could leave behind the limitations of her family's expectations and step into a world where she would never be looked down upon. To the townspeople, the two of them together looked like a story out of cinema. Pragati, young and radiant, with dreams shining in her eyes, and Arvind, the powerful man with the means to make those dreams real. When their relationship became public, it stirred gossip. Some called it a love story that symbolized ambition meeting opportunity. Others whispered warnings, especially about Arvind's background. Families in Auraiya were not blind to his rumored connections with criminal activity. There were stories of men who had gone against him and lost their land, of business rivals who mysteriously vanished from the scene, but nothing was ever proven. To Pragati, however, these whispers were just envy dressed as caution. She convinced herself that love was bigger than suspicion. The early days of their relationship felt like the fulfillment of a promise. Arvind showered her with gifts that others in the village could only dream of. Silk saris, gold trinkets, weekend drives to neighboring cities, and the occasional stay at luxury hotels. For Pragati, these moments were intoxicating. They made her believe she had made the right choice, that her trust in Arvind was not misplaced. She pictured a future where she would no longer be restricted to the small boundaries of Auraiya but would rise alongside him, creating a life that looked enviable from every angle. Her family, however, did not share her optimism. They had raised their daughter with love and wanted the best for her, but they sensed danger in Arvind's confidence. Pragati's mother quietly cried at night, worrying about her daughter's safety, while her father remained silent, his disapproval hidden behind measured expression. No amount of reasoning or warnings could sway Pragati. For her, Arvind was not just a man, he was her ticket to the life she had always dreamed of. And when she made up her mind, she never turned back. But as the days passed, small cracks began to show beneath the surface of their glamorous picture. Pragati noticed that Arvind's phone would ring late at night, and he would walk away from her to take those calls. Strange visitors, rough-looking men with tense faces, would arrive at their doorstep, only to leave hurriedly after brief conversations. Bags of cash were moved discreetly, and Pragati's questions about them were brushed aside. Still, she convinced herself that every man with ambition had secrets, and Arvind's world was simply bigger and more complicated than hers. Aura of love can blind even the sharpest eyes, and Pragati's story was no different. She clung to the idea of a perfect beginning, refusing to acknowledge the shadows that already lurked behind her relationship. To the outside world, her life appeared like the fulfillment of a fantasy, a small-town girl rising into a life of wealth and comfort. Yet beneath that glittering surface, an invisible storm was already brewing, one that would eventually turn her perfect beginning into a nightmare too horrifying to imagine. Arvind Bhadouria's life was not what it appeared to be from the outside. While people in Auraiya admired his polished image, the truth lay in a darker reality that few dared to speak about. He was deeply tied to networks that thrived on crime, illegal land grabs, extortion rackets, and shadowy deals that made him powerful beyond measure. His charm and wealth acted as a mask, hiding a ruthless side that rarely came into public view. Pragati Yadav, who once believed she had found her escape from a life of limitations, slowly began noticing the signs that pointed to Arvind's dangerous world. It started with the visitor. They were not the kind of people who usually walked into a respectable businessman's home. Some came with bruises on their faces. Others carried a nervous energy that lingered even after they left. They arrived at odd hours, sometimes close to midnight, and they rarely spoke to Pragati. Instead, they waited quietly until Arvind met them in private, handing over documents or bags that were later hidden away. Pragati's curiosity grew, and with it came unease. She had been raised in a place where people whispered about such men, calling them deal-makers or fixers, but she never thought her own home would become a place where these kinds of transactions occurred. Arvind's closest ally was a man named Nitin Chaubey. Unlike Arvind, Nitin lacked refinement. He was rough, direct, and seemed to live in the shadows of his master. His loyalty to Arvind was unquestionable. If Arvind was the face of the empire, Nitin was the enforcer, ensuring debts were paid, threats were silenced, and rivals were eliminated. Pragati never trusted him. Whenever Nitin visited, she felt an air of hostility around him, as though he viewed her as an outsider trespassing on their carefully guarded world. His glances carried warnings that told her to mind her own business. Arvind's behavior toward Pragati also began to change. The man who once showered her with affection grew restless, possessive, and controlling. He questioned her every move, monitored her phone calls, and demanded to know who she spoke to. At first, Pragati dismissed it as jealousy, the kind that came from love, but over time it became suffocating. She no longer felt like the independent woman she once was. Instead, she felt trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by wealth but stripped of freedom. It was during this suffocating phase that Pragati reconnected with Samir Rathod, a familiar face from her past. Samir was everything Arvind was not: calm, stable, and honest. Working as a government officer, he had built a respectable career, rooted in integrity. When Pragati stumbled upon his presence again through a chance encounter, it felt like a breath of fresh air. Their conversations were at first light-hearted, a way for her to remember the carefree days of her youth. But as her relationship with Arvind grew more toxic, Samir became a quiet anchor. He represented the life she had once dreamed of, one of peace and dignity, not fear and secrets. Pragati knew she was playing with fire. If Arvind discovered her connection with Samir, his reaction would be unpredictable. Yet the pull towards Samir was strong because he reminded her of what she was losing: her independence, her joy, her sense of self. While Arvind controlled her movements, she began to create small pockets of rebellion, slipping away to meet Samir for brief moments. Those meetings gave her courage, but they also placed her in greater danger than she realized. Arvind's instincts were sharp, and his empire thrived on suspicion. It did not take long before he noticed Pragati's subtle changes: the way she guarded her phone, the moments she seemed distant, the sparks of defiance that replaced her earlier compliance. He confided in Nitin, who was always eager to feed his master's doubt. Nitin whispered that Pragati was hiding something, that perhaps she was planning to leave. The words burned into Arvind's mind, intensifying his obsession. Behind his composed exterior, Arvind became consumed by paranoia. His nights were spent going through Pragati's belongings, checking her messages, questioning her absences. The love story that had once captivated Auraiya had shifted into something far darker. The whispers about Arvind's dangerous world were no longer just rumors to Pragati. They were the truth she now lived in. Every step she took was shadowed by fear, every choice laced with risk. The secrets Arvind kept were becoming her burden, and the secret she carried about Samir was becoming her biggest gamble. In the silence of her room at night, Pragati realized she was caught in a trap. To escape would mean betraying Arvind, but to stay would mean losing herself entirely. What she did not know was that her hesitation was already too late. Arvind had begun watching her closely, and his love was slowly turning into an obsession that would change everything forever. Arvind Bhadoria's doubts about Pragati had grown into a storm that refused to calm down. He could not shake the feeling that she was slipping away from him, that the woman he had once controlled completely was now plotting against him in silence. Each time she looked distracted, each time she hesitated to answer his questions, he read betrayal in her eyes. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that Pragati was no longer his alone. His obsession with her loyalty turned his love into a dangerous fixation. Nitin Chaubey played a pivotal role in stoking this paranoia. He had long believed Pragati's presence in Arvind's life was a weakness. In his eyes, women brought distractions and danger, and Pragati was no different. He whispered into Arvind's ears that she was keeping secrets, that her sudden interest in going out or speaking privately on the phone was not innocent. Nitin suggested that Pragati might even be conspiring with Arvind's enemies, an idea that poisoned Arvind's thoughts completely. Once these suspicions took hold, they consumed him. Pragati, meanwhile, was quietly planning her own escape. The suffocation of her life with Arvind was unbearable. She had gone from dreaming of freedom to being trapped in a gilded prison. Every gift, every display of wealth, now felt like shackles weighing her down. Her reconnection with Samir Rathod had shown her a glimpse of what she truly wanted. Samir's calm words, his straightforward way of life, his respect for her individuality, all of it reminded her that she still had a chance to choose differently. She began gathering her important documents, setting aside small amounts of money, and plotting a path out of Auraiya. With Samir's help, she believed she could leave this toxic relationship behind and start anew. But secrecy is fragile, and Arvind's world was one built on surveillance. Nothing escaped his notice for long. He saw the small changes in her routines, the way she guarded her bag, the way she sometimes glanced at her phone with a flicker of hope. He interpreted her silence as guilt. His love had twisted into something violent, a need to control her at all costs. Pragati's attempts at freedom only pushed him further into madness. Arvind's decision to deal with Pragati's perceived betrayal was not immediate. He wrestled with it, torn between the woman he once adored and the suspicion that now devoured him. But with Nitin's constant presence, pushing him toward harsher measures, the outcome became inevitable. Nitin told him bluntly that letting Pragati go would mean humiliation, that she would take his secrets with her and destroy everything he had built. Arvind's empire was built on fear and dominance. Losing control of the one person closest to him felt like a defeat worse than death. Finally, Arvind crafted a plan that masked itself as romance, but was poisoned with violence. He told Pragati he wanted to take her on a private trip, away from Auraiya, just the two of them. He suggested it would be a chance to mend what was broken, to rekindle the love they once shared. Pragati, though wary, saw an opportunity in if she could gain a moment of freedom away from the constant eyes of his men, perhaps she could find a way to slip out of his grasp. She agreed, believing it might be the chance she was waiting for. On a warm April night, Arvind and Pragati left the city in a black SUV, with Nitin behind the wheel. The air was heavy with silence. Pragati stared out of the window, imagining a different future, while Arvind's mind burned with thoughts of betrayal. Nitin drove them toward a secluded farmhouse on the outskirts of Auraiya. The house stood isolated, surrounded by tall fields and broken fences, a place where no one would disturb them. Pragati thought they were there to talk, to repair the cracks in their relationship. She had no idea it was the very stage where her fate would be sealed. Inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere shifted. The warmth of reconciliation she had hoped for never appeared. Instead, Arvind's simmering rage exploded. He confronted her with the evidence he believed proved her betrayal: the late calls, the hidden documents, the connection with Samir Rathod. Each accusation was heavier than the last, and the love that once bound them was replaced with venom. The walls of the farmhouse became witnesses to a storm that could not be calmed. For Pragati, the dream of escape now hung by a thread. She realized too late that the man she once trusted with her life had transformed into a figure of obsession and fear. The trip she thought might lead her to freedom had instead brought her into a carefully laid trap. Arvind's obsession had reached its breaking point, and Pragati was standing at the very edge of the abyss, unaware of just how far he was willing to go to ensure she never left him. The farmhouse on the outskirts of Auraiya stood in silence, its walls carrying the weight of secrets that no one outside would ever guess. That night, as the heavy wooden door closed behind them, Pragati Yadav felt a strange chill crawl over her skin. She had walked into the place thinking it might be a turning point, a chance for reconciliation, but in truth, it was a cage designed for her downfall. The atmosphere inside was tense, the dim lights casting long shadows on the cracked walls. Arvind Bhadoria's eyes, once filled with admiration and charm, now burned with suspicion and fury. He began pacing the room, his voice rising, though the words were not meant to seek truth, but to enforce his belief that she had betrayed him. Pragati realized quickly that he already had a conclusion in his mind, and nothing she could say or do would change it. Her silence, her attempts to remain calm, only made him angrier. Arvind saw every quiet glance as guilt, every hesitation as confirmation. For him, Pragati was no longer the woman he had fallen for, but a danger that threatened to dismantle his pride, his empire, and his control. Nitin Chaubey remained close, his presence heavy like a shadow that could not be shaken off. He locked the farmhouse door and lingered silently, watching Arvind unravel in rage. Nitin was not a man of many words, but his loyalty was unyielding. His role was not to question but to act when told, and in that moment, his silence reassured Arvind that he had someone who would stand by him in whatever came next. Pragati noticed the way Nitin's eyes followed her, cold, detached, as though she were not even human anymore, but just another problem to be erased. Arvind's confrontation escalated. He accused her of plotting against him, of conspiring with Rathod, of preparing to run away with his secrets. In his twisted perspective, her yearning for freedom was treachery. The love story that had once seemed enviable was now buried under layers of rage and obsession. Pragati tried to steady her breathing, but her body betrayed her with trembling hands. She could sense the danger circling closer with every passing second. It did not take long before Arvind's fury turned physical. In a sudden burst, he grabbed her, his strength overpowering her resistance. The room filled with the sound of struggle, her attempts to break free colliding with his determination to crush her spirit. His grip tightened around her, fueled not by love, but by obsession that had spiraled into madness. The farmhouse echoed with the muffled sounds of a life fighting desperately to survive. Nitin stood nearby, unmoved, his face as still as stone. He had seen violence before, but this was different. This was not a business rival, or an enemy. This was the woman who once stood beside his master. Yet for Nitin, loyalty mattered more than morality. When the struggle finally ended, Pragati Yadav lay motionless on the floor. The vibrant woman who had once dreamed of freedom was gone, her life extinguished in the hands of the man who once promised her the world. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Arvind's unsteady breaths. His rage had consumed him fully, leaving behind the irreversible reality of what he had done. Pragati was no longer his to control, no longer anyone. Panic should have followed, but Arvind's world had long prepared him for covering the consequences of his choices. Nitin immediately took charge of the situation, suggesting they could not let anyone know what had happened. If Pragati's disappearance became a matter of suspicion, Arvind's entire empire could collapse. The farmhouse, isolated and forgotten by most, became the place to hide her forever. Together they dug a shallow grave in the backyard, the soil loose from years of neglect. Under the pale light of the moon, they lowered Pragati's body into the earth, covering her with layers of dirt, until no trace of her remained. The act was carried out without hesitation, as though it were just another business deal complete. Arvind watched in silence, his expression hard, his heart numb. He convinced himself that she had forced his hand, that betrayal deserved punishment. In his twisted mind, this was justice. By morning Arvind had crafted his story.
He returned to Auraiya and told those who asked that Pragati had left him after an argument, that she was unwilling to adjust to his life. His calm tone and composed manner made the lie believable to many. People shook their heads, blaming the fragility of modern relationships, never realizing the truth was buried deep in the soil of that farmhouse. For a brief time, Arvind believed he had succeeded. He thought the world would accept his version of events, and Pragati's disappearance would fade into silence. But the earth never hides its secrets forever, and the shallow grave he left behind would soon drag him into a reckoning he could not escape. The days following Pragati Yadav's disappearance brought unease to Auraiya. Arvind Bhadoria moved through the town with his usual confidence, repeating the same story to anyone who asked. He told people Pragati had left him after an argument, that she wanted something different, and had walked away without warning. To the casual observer, it seemed believable. His wealth, charm, and power made it easy for him to control the narrative. Yet beneath the surface, doubts lingered. Pragati was not the kind of woman to vanish without explanation, and her family knew this more than anyone. Her parents were the first to sense that something was terribly wrong. They refused to accept Arvind's version of events. Days passed, then weeks, without a single word from their daughter. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Her belongings were left behind, and no one in her circle had seen her. Their worry grew into desperation, and finally they filed a missing persons report. That decision shifted everything. The case was handed to Inspector Raghav Tandon, a seasoned officer known for his persistence and sharp instincts. Inspector Tandon approached the case with caution. He had heard stories about Arvind Bhadoria before, rumors of his illegal businesses, and whispers of people who had disappeared after crossing him, but none had ever been proven. Pragati's case gave him a chance to peel back the polished mask Arvind wore in public. He began by gathering phone records, examining her last known movements, and speaking to those who had interacted with her in the weeks before she vanished. Very quickly, inconsistencies surfaced. Pragati's phone records showed frequent communication with Rathod, a government officer, whose name Arvind had failed to mention. The messages revealed plans, hints of her desire to leave, and fragments of conversations that suggested she was unhappy and desperate to escape. This new angle gave the investigation momentum. If Pragati had been planning to run, why had she suddenly disappeared without a trace? Where had she gone on the night she was last seen with Arvind? Witnesses also came forward quietly, speaking in hushed tones about seeing Arvind's SUV heading out of the city late at night with Nitin Chaubey driving. Though none dared to accuse Arvind openly, their statements added to the suspicion. Inspector Tandon began building a picture that contradicted the story Arvind had spread. Pragati had not left of her own will. Something darker had happened. The turning point came when the investigation focused on the farmhouse at the edge of Auraiya. Neighbors reported seeing lights there on the night of Pragati's disappearance, though the property had been abandoned for years. Acting on this lead, officers raided the farmhouse. What they found beneath the disturbed soil in the backyard confirmed their worst fear. The body of Pragati Yadav lay hidden in a shallow grave, her life ended by the very man who once claimed to love her. The discovery sent shockwaves through the district. Auraiya, which had once admired Arvind for his wealth and influence, now looked at him with horror. His calm lies crumbled under the weight of evidence. Inspector Tandon arrested both Arvind and Nitin. During questioning, Nitin was the first to break. Under pressure he confessed to everything: the confrontation, the murder, and the burial. His loyalty to Arvind ended the moment the truth was forced out of him. Arvind, though initially defiant, could not escape the net closing around him. The evidence was overwhelming, and his empire of lies collapsed piece by piece. The courtroom became the stage for the final unraveling. The story that had once been painted as a glamorous romance was stripped down to its brutal reality, a tale of obsession, betrayal, and murder. Pragati's family, though broken by grief, found strength in knowing the truth had surfaced. They had fought to make sure her disappearance was not dismissed, and their persistence ensured justice would be sought. For Auraiya, the case left scars that would not heal quickly. It reminded people that behind wealth and charm, darkness can thrive unseen. The story of Pragati Yadav became a cautionary tale, told in hushed voices across the district. It was no longer remembered as a love story, but as a horrifying tragedy that no one wanted. In the end, Arvind Bhadoria was no longer the admired figure he once pretended to be. He was stripped of power, his empire destroyed, his name forever tied to a crime that shocked everyone. Pragati's fate, though tragic, exposed the truth behind the man who had fooled so many. The farmhouse where she lost her life stood abandoned once again, but now it was marked forever by the memory of what happened there. A reminder that secrets buried in the earth never stay hidden forever.